All right. Good morning, everyone. My name's Stephen Cooper with Juniper Networks, and I'm going to talk through what we've seen so far with Wi-Fi 6E and 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi, and also give you some updates on, what are the latest and greatest features with Wi-Fi 7, what we see happening in the market with that, and sort of wrap it up with our new AP that we launched recently too. So you're probably familiar with a lot of the Wi-Fi generations across the years and the different bands that we've had to support as well with Wi-Fi. Obviously, we started with 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, and really one of the biggest breakthroughs that we had in Wi-Fi in the last decade or so was the introduction of the 6 gigahertz spectrum with Wi-Fi 6E in 2022. And now we're taking more and more advantage of that as the Wi-Fi protocols mature, and this will be a bit of a discussion of saying what's real, what's actually going to be useful, and what we have seen in the market too. So I'm not going to go into too much of a deep dive of 6 gigahertz. There's a lot of great other presentations out there, not just from Juniper, but also other vendors and at Wireless LAN Professionals Conference. So I'll just sort of touch on some of the key points here. Obviously, this introduces new spectrum. Currently across Europe, we don't have as much spectrum available to use in 6 gigahertz as the US and some of the other regulatory domains in the world, but we do have a bunch of extra channels that we can now make use of. And there's going to be, hopefully, over time, as more of the regulatory bodies such as ETSI and other regulatory bodies assess the incumbents in the upper 6 gigahertz band and Uni 6 and 7 and 8, we'll hopefully see over the next couple of years that we'll be able to take advantage of all these additional channels that will be available to us, because that will allow us to do more things across the spectrum. One of the big things which is also sort of following this additional spectrum availability is different device classifications that have been introduced with Wi-Fi 6E and will be used through Wi-Fi 7 as well. So we have the concept of low power indoor devices, which are typically your mobile clients and your indoor access points that hang on the ceiling. You have standard power devices. This is only sort of allowed in the US at the moment, as they use automated frequency coordination systems to coordinate with the incumbents in 6 gigahertz. What ETSI and some of the other bodies are working here in Europe is a spectrum access service, which will perform an equivalent function, which is also dependent on allowing that additional spectrum. So once they've worked out the nuts and bolts of how that spectrum access service is going to work across Europe, then we should be in a better state to be able to adopt the rest of that 6 gigahertz spectrum. The other common one that you'll see is very low power VLP, which we are approved to use in Europe. So we can use outdoor 6 gigahertz, but it is very low transmit power. And I'll go into a bit more detail on that on the next slide. So you can see, there's some different levels of transmit power in EIRP. We're now referring to power spectral density in the 6 gigahertz world. So we're talking about what the transmit power is per megahertz of that spectrum that's being used. So you can see that's a different nomenclature. It's a different way of thinking about transmit power, both from the downlink from APs to clients as well as uplink from clients to APs. Luckily, in Europe and UK, we're not restricted as much as what the US is from a client transmit power perspective. So the uplink is actually going to be quite favorable for 6 gigahertz deployments across Europe. And then you can see obviously at the bottom for very low power clients, 14 dBm EIRP maximum, which means your transmit power is going to be lower to compensate for antenna gains and multi-MIMO and stuff like that. So this is a good reference slide by Peter McKenzie. So highly recommend just sort of bookmarking this one. With the additional spectrum and bands available, with all these additional channels, it introduces some complexity and additional scanning times for clients to determine where to associate to the next APs and to perform their scanning for roaming purposes. So there's been some introduction of new scanning modes, such as reduced neighbor reports and improvements to 8 to 11K, so that Wi-Fi clients can find their next 6 gigahertz APs and connect to, but also roam seamlessly, or as seamlessly as possible, from, say, 5 gigahertz networks to 6 gigahertz networks. So I won't go into too much detail about this, but definitely recommend researching about reduced neighbor reports. It's the most common way that clients are finding their way onto 6 gigahertz networks. We're seeing it's best to sort of deploy dual band or tri-band SSIDs, so that when you have the beacons advertised on 5 gigahertz, they're advertising the network for 6 gigahertz as well, so the clients can use those reduced neighbor reports to find that. There's also some learnings that we've had around preferred scanning channels. Originally, we thought that clients were only going to scan on the preferred scanning channels throughout the spectrum, and that we've now found that's not the case. You can pretty much deploy any of those channel combinations in 6 gigahertz, and we handle that automatically through MIST with the RF templates and radio resource management. One thing we do, and this is not defined by the standard, it's not defined by 802.11ax or Wi-Fi 6E certification. It's basically, how do you want to advertise these reduced neighbor reports? And we've basically taken the approach of each AP will then advertise its next two nearest neighbors to make it even easier for the client to go, okay, I'm going to roam to a sensible nearby roaming candidate as opposed to roaming to an AP, 3 rooms over, which is not going to give you the best signal strength. So we're taking advantage of this with Juniper MIST, and we've seen some great results with that. And so if we look at 6 gigahertz adoption, this was sort of introduced nearly 3 years ago. And, we've seen Wi-Fi 6E clients and access points in the market for a couple of years now. Just want a show of hands, who's deployed 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi already, whether it's at home or in the office corporate use? Okay. Who's deployed 6 gigahertz capable access points but hasn't actually enabled 6 gigahertz? Okay, a few of you. Yeah, so there's still some transition points happening. So, we are 2.5 to 3 years after this has been introduced, and we're still not seeing saturation in the market, but we are seeing some great uptake. So if we look at a particular customer of ours, on their network, nearly 18,000 wireless clients, and nearly 4,000 of those have been just connecting on 6 gigahertz. So that's a combination of laptops, smartphones, and that's a pretty good success rate. And then if we look at some smaller environments, we see an even greater percentage. So obviously it's going to be a mixed environment depending on what your customer's install base is, what the devices are, what they're capable of. And then we even see some instances where we've seen more 6 gigahertz clients connected to the network than 5 or 2.4. So, these are some great numbers just to show that 6 gigahertz is real, it's being used, it's out there, but obviously it still takes some time for 6 gigahertz to be mature and widespreadly, adopted in the marketplace. So let's talk about the next big thing, Wi-Fi 7. So this is, like Elliot was saying earlier about all the buzzwords and architecture, we're hearing all of this with Wi-Fi 7 as well, all the speeds and feeds, and we're going to apparently have 46 gigabits per second possible with Wi-Fi 7 through the air, thanks to 30 megahertz wide channels. Wider channels means more bandwidth, and that's also thanks to higher amplitude modulation with 4K QAM. Now, if you, like us, have worked in the industry for a while, you've seen these generations of Wi-Fi over time. You would have seen all the data sheets and marketing brochures saying all of these speeds are possible in a lab environment, in a perfect world where there's no interference, there's no other neighbors on the network, and everything isn't completely fine-tuned. Yes, this might be possible, but that's not really the reality, is it? So where we're seeing the marketing terms of 46 gigabits per second, that's based on an access point and client having 16 spatial streams and using a 320 megahertz wide channel. Yeah, most enterprise APs will probably top out at again, theoretical maximum of 26 gigabits per second, because we're going to be having 4 spatial stream APs. And most clients are 1 or 2 spatial stream these days. So gone are the days of having a 3 spatial stream MacBook. Apple MacBooks are now, 2 spatial streams as well. So that means the data rates are going to come down quite a bit. Realistically, especially here in Europe, we're not going to be using 320 megahertz wide channels, let alone 160s. Maybe 80s, probably not. So, 40 megahertz wide, you could expect to get 688 megabits per second as your association rate with a high signal to noise ratio associated there. So then you need to cater for real world throughput due to the overheads of how 802.11 works. You're going to get maybe anywhere as low as half of that 688. But new spectrum is still good news. It's still really good to take advantage of that too. And where are we at with Wi-Fi 7? So Wi-Fi 7's been talked about for quite a long time, just like 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi has, but we're still not quite there with the final ratification and approval of the IEEE 802.11be standard. Almost there. It's supposed to be slated for December, but anything could happen with that. We have the Wi-Fi certification process from the Wi-Fi Alliance was introduced earlier this year. There's probably going to be a release 2 of that once this BE standard is finalized. So nothing much should change, but some of the things I'll start to talk about with these features, as we've seen with 802.11ax and Wi-Fi 6, will they actually make it into the reality and be useful in the real world is the big question. So Some of the core features of Wi-Fi 7 is, more spatial streams. As I mentioned, up to 16 spatial streams is possible. Doesn't mean it's going to be usable. Wider channels, higher amplitude modulation with 4K QAM, multi-RU and preamble puncturing, multi-link operation, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail because that seems to be the hot topic with Wi-Fi 7. And there's some other features around, quality of service and some improvements around latency, which may or may not make its way into as well. So, as I mentioned, 16 spatial streams is allowed in the standard, it's specified in the standard. It's possible for chipset vendors to implement this, but very likely it won't be implemented. It's not smart to when you think about the capabilities required to power these sorts of chipsets. There'll be cost limitations, there'll be size limitations in terms of what you can put into client devices, and it's just going to be too costly to do this. So I don't expect that we'll see 16 spatial stream APs out there using all of those 16 spatial streams at once. It just won't be possible. As I mentioned already, this is a better visualization of the channel widths that we have available. In Europe, we have one 320 megahertz wide channel available to us. So maybe if you're testing at home and none of your neighbors are running 6 gigahertz, you could safely run this without any interference. Are your clients going to support 320 megahertz? Probably not. They might support 160. So we have 3 non-overlapping channels of 160 megahertz wide and 6 gigahertz. Where does that sound familiar? That's no better than 2.4, right? So we're most likely going to see either 80 megahertz or 40 megahertz used in 6 gigahertz for better channel reuse in the environment. And until we get that additional spectrum opened up, I think that's going to be sort of the norm, is to see 40 megahertz and 6 gigahertz deployed across Europe. The increased complexity to get these higher data rates does require 4K QAM, which is more computationally intensive, requires more processing power, more battery, it requires really high signal to noise ratio, but it's still achievable. One of the early misconceptions when Wi-Fi 6 and 802.11ax was being talked about was that, okay, to get, MCS rates of 13 or higher, above that sort of data rate and signal to noise ratio, you're going to have to be pretty much right next to the access point with your phone, on the ceiling. And then we found in the real world, you could actually achieve, MCS 11 sort of rates and still get a really high data rate just on a normal desk versus, ceiling mounted AP deployment. So we're thinking 4K QAM might not be unachievable, but how useful is it with those data rates is another question. Preamble puncturing is a very, very interesting concept. This was first talked about with 802.11ax, but didn't actually make it into the final standard or Wi-Fi 6 because it was too difficult, essentially. But this means that as 802.11ax has come into the 6 gigahertz band with Wi-Fi 6E and now Wi-Fi 7, making use of OFDMA and multiple resource units, we can actually, and theoretically, if we detect on any of those 20, 40, or 80 megahertz wide 6 gigahertz channels, if we detect an interferer on just a small slice of one of those channels, instead of just ruling out that channel and saying it's been interfered with, it's dead, we have to go off to another channel or back off and wait our contention window time, we could actually say, let's adapt around that and then start to make more of that channel usable while we avoid that interferer and keep the airtime utilization humming along nicely as we should. So haven't seen this in the real world yet. Really cool to see if it actually gets implemented properly by both Wi-Fi chipset vendors for access points and clients. Multi-RU is a very similar concept. It's around making more efficient use of these 20, 40, and 80 megahertz channels when we're using OFDMA. Wi-Fi 6 introduced the concept of resource units, and you could then break each of these channels up, but it was a static allocation of resource unit size to client devices on that channel. Now we can actually break up these channels into different sizes of RUs based on the client capabilities, the traffic that's being sent, and obviously the RF conditions. And again, more utilize that available channel as best as we can, depending on the RF environment. So it's about maintaining that airtime efficiency as well. Now we're on to the big one. This is the big buzzword about Wi-Fi 7. Everyone's probably heard about MLO and multi-link operation. A lot of the consumer and home-grade Wi-Fi routers that came out earlier this year and late last year were saying, okay, we've got Wi-Fi 7, we've got multi-link operation, and that's all well and good, but there was no client devices out to support it at that time. Now we're sort of starting to see this come out in the fold with enterprise access point vendors and clients. But essentially, there's 3 main aspects that multi-link operation is aiming to sort of improve with Wi-Fi experience. One of those is not just about throughput, which is, all the speeds and feeds with 4K QAM and all that good stuff. Lower latency is probably going to be one of the biggest benefits of multi-link operation, and then it can also be used for enhanced reliability. So I'll talk a little bit more about what's possible with that. But I just want to sort of just reassure you, we're still early on this journey. Just like with Wi-Fi 6 and 802.11ax, we haven't seen all of those features maturely implemented. So I just did this little meme here, just going, well, what happened to target wait time? What happened to BSS coloring? Who's actually using BSS coloring in the real world apart from just advertising it and the capabilities of the beacon? What's actually happening with multi-user MIMO? Is any client device actually actively using multi-user MIMO out there today? We haven't really seen it. We've seen OFDMA, but there's still OFDMA improvements being worked on even for 802.11ax today. So OFDMA is still being improved 4 years after the fact. So, MLO is the hot, shiny new thing, but it might take a few years until it's up there. So the first way that we can get increased reliability is steering clients between, 5 or 6 gigahertz or a least congested channel and, maybe less channel utilization or less clients associated on that particular channel on an AP to get some better application performance out of that. Data aggregation is where the speeds and feeds come in, is basically using both, a 5 and 6 gigahertz radio to transmit and receive data over multiple channels at this, concurrently. And then you could also use this for redundancy. So you could actually send a duplicate transmission on 2 alternate channels to basically say, I've improved my chances of getting that transmission across and getting an acknowledgement and not having to then retry that transmission. So that could be an improvement from a redundancy and resiliency perspective. So the first one we're going to talk about is link switching, and we're starting to see this being implemented in pretty much all Wi-Fi 7 clients because it's the most basic feature set capable from these Wi-Fi 7 radios, is basically time domain static switching. So basically, a client radio and an access point will switch between 5 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz and constantly check which one is cleaner, which one has more available airtime or channel capacity, and then choose which one to then fully associate on and complete its data transmission or reception before going back to check which channel is cleaner. So it does require some switching between there. It does introduce some latency from doing that, but the overall latency is reduced because you're actually transmitting on a cleaner channel. The next one is enhanced multi-link single radio, which is also, we're starting to see very common in a lot of Wi-Fi clients. This means that a Wi-Fi client radio can actually be associated to 2 channels at the same time. It could be 2.4 and 5, it could be 5 and 6, but it's actively listening on those channels all the time. So it's not having to switch between them to listen and then make the determination which one's more available or has better airtime availability. So it can dynamically switch when it needs to. And because it's got this dual association state, it can do that switching dynamically. It could do part of its transmission on 5 gigahertz, it could do the other part of the transmission on 6 gigahertz. So it only requires one radio on the client to do this, which is pretty cool. Then the most complex one, and the one that actually requires multiple radios on a client, and hence this impacts battery life, size of the radios, size of the client device, is where we have multi-link, multi-radio concurrently used for simultaneous transmit and receive. And this is where a lot of the buzzwords have come from multi-link operations. It's where people have sort of got this unproven, or should I say, unrealized expectation that Wi-Fi now might be full duplex, because you could theoretically transmit and receive at the same time on a single client to access point radio. So yes, if everything was perfect, if the RF was perfect, if everything lined up and was synchronized well, and your 5 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz signal strength from the client perspective was perfect to not cause it to roam, you could theoretically achieve simultaneous transmit and receive, but it's very difficult to get there. What we're actually seeing is there'll be some support for multi-link, multi-radio, but again, it's sort of more of a hybrid flavor of this enhanced multi-link single radio, where they're still switching between, but it's yet to be seen whether these client vendors will actually introduce software support for this as well. So what does this look like on a client? This is a Windows 11 client with a Qualcomm chipset, and we can see right down the bottom, I know it's a bit small, but it's essentially associated to 6 gigahertz on channel 117 and 5 gigahertz on channel 36 at the same time. Running a similar view from the command line, we can see what its RSSI is. So it's got -60 on 2.4 gigahertz on channel 6, This one's then got negative 69 on channel 36 on 5 gigahertz. And then on a Pixel device, we can then see this is associated across all 3 bands. And 2.4, it's getting 270 megabits per second association rate, 5 gigahertz, 573 megabits per second, and 6 gigahertz, up to 1.9 gig, theoretically. So it's out there, it's possible. But what is the current state? We've seen, different flavors of multi-link operation support across different client devices and also vendor access points. The big one that came out recently was the iPhone 16 and 16 Pro. It can do MLSR, but not simultaneous transmit and receive. So it's like, well, what's the real benefit of doing MLSR if you can't do simultaneous transmit and receive? I don't know what the answer is for that. But then we do see some clients where they can do simultaneous transmit and receive, such as the Pixel 9, and they can do it on 2.4 and 5, not necessarily 5 and 6. So they could do it on 2.4 and 5 or 2.4 and 6, but not 5 and 6. So again, what's the usefulness of that in the real world? Wouldn't you really have the option to be able to say, we just want to deploy 5 and 6 gigahertz and do away with 2.4? Unfortunately, these devices today in software don't support that. So a software update might fix that in future. One of the other big things is, especially with the early access points and consumer grade devices that came out there, they support multi-link operations, but they're only dual band. So if you just do a quick look through MediaMarkt or any of the other online retailers, you look at the latest, ASUS routers or TP-Link or anything, you'll have MLO dual band and you'll have MLO tri-band, and the tri-band's probably about another 40% more expensive. So some people get caught out by that. So just because it's Wi-Fi 7, just because it supports multi-link operation, doesn't necessarily mean it supports 6 gigahertz as well. So keep an eye out for that. One of the cool things about multi-link operations is that because it's designed to work across all 3 bands, the clients are then actually going to be capable of having simultaneous associations across all 3 bands at one time. That was the eMLSR component. What this means is then obviously a traditional association, each client has a different MAC address for its different radio chipsets, 2.4 versus 5, and the association on the relative access point radio. It's now combined into a higher level multi-link MLD MAC address. So we actually have one MAC address represented for those 2 or 3 simultaneous associations. What that actually means in the real world from the perspective of the client, moving between 2.4, 5, and 6 gigahertz on the same access point, we've actually eliminated interband roaming on individual access points. So a client no longer has to do an 802.11 fast roam or just a full roam when going from 2.4 to 5 or 5 to 6 or 2.4 to 6 on the same access point, because it's got this dual or tri-radio association happening all at one time, which is pretty cool. Obviously from AP to AP, you're moving BSSIDs, that will still require roaming, but at least on the same access point, the transition as you go across those 3 frequency bands should be a lot smoother. So we can see the multi-link MAC address up there, as well as the actual client MAC address with just a different octet on the end. So there's some other security enhancements. I'll go into a few more details in a few slides about this, but essentially because you've got that dual or tri-radio association and operation of MLO across those 3 frequency bands, it means that from a security perspective, you need to have the same AKMs across the 3 bands. You can't switch between WPA2 on 2.4 and then WPA3 on 5 and 6. It's just not going to work. It's actually going to break that mechanism and not be secure. So there's additional improvements around that. And, as 6 gigahertz introduced for 6E, we've got WPA3 is mandatory in that 6 gigahertz band too. So there's definitely some other considerations about getting your network ready for 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi and Wi-Fi 7. Some of you might already be on that journey today as you raise your hands. Obviously device support we've talked a bit about, multi-gig switching, powering your access points, and then also the transmit power levels that you consider for designing, as well as the security considerations. So this has been an age-old question. Even over a decade ago, the Ethernet Gigabit Alliance and also, Wi-Fi Alliance was pushing multi-gig is required for Wi-Fi. Is it real? Who thinks they can sustain 1 gigabit per second throughput consistently on an AP? Rob can, so he'll demo that to you later. This is the first real chance we have at exceeding 1 gigabit per second of real throughput on an access point, because you need a minimum of 100 megahertz wide channel to be able to do that. So if you have 160 megahertz operating, or if you've got multi-link operations running across 5 gigahertz and 6 gigahertz combined, you might have over 100 megahertz of spectrum being used, so you might exceed 1 gigabit per second. What we're really seeing in the real world, still even with Wi-Fi 6E, is about 400 to 500 megabits per second is the average peak throughput that we're seeing across a lot of deployments. So that we do expect to change, but it's still early days. Expect to need 8023 BT or PoE++ power, not necessarily to operate your access points, but definitely to power them up and get them to boot up. Different vendors will do different operating modes for lower power operations, such as 8023 AT, which we'll have for the AP47, but just be mindful of that as well on your switches. I showed this earlier about transmit power levels. This really factors into your designs. Down in use, we were talking about your client uplink perspective from the client to the access point is really important. And we're sort of seeing, a similar density for carpeted office environments for 6 gigahertz as 5 gigahertz. But then you've got to consider that across your fleet, what we've seen in a sample across MIST customers is they're negative 55 dBm for 5 gigahertz and almost a 10 dB difference for 6 gigahertz. So that needs to be considered too, especially when you're talking about roaming. Maybe you're doing overlap for redundancy or secondary coverage for voice over Wi-Fi, and also multi-link operation you need to consider that for as well. Security, this is sort of just a good reference around WPA3 and some of the requirements there. WPA3 Enterprise we've seen as the most low risk and safe and easiest to move to, because most of your clients that are running WPA2 Enterprise today with 802.1x and certificates can just use the same configuration profiles and automatically associate to that. So that's the easy one. WPA3 Personal or SAE, it really just depends on the device support. I'm still seeing a lot of old devices surprisingly support WPA3, which is fantastic. They might only be 802.11n or AC devices, but they actually surprisingly support WPA3, which is really nice. And then OWE, which is enhanced open, there's been some mixed support for that. But across some customers that we've seen, we've looked at a large customer with tens of thousands of clients over the years, and we can see this increased adoption rate now to 98% of their clients, adopting WPA3 Personal or WPA3 SAE on a transition SSID. So they've deployed WPA3 transition, and over the last couple of years, those devices have just natively moved over to using WPA3 thanks to driver updates and firmware updates, and that's really cool to see. OWE, mostly safe. Some Apple devices had some problems for a while, but they're getting better with support there. You need to consider your roaming behaviors of your clients from not only a security perspective, but also channel bandwidth, especially when you're deploying 5 and 6 gigahertz and 2.4 gigahertz, obviously 20 megahertz and 20 and 2.4. But, what are you deploying in 5 gigahertz versus 6 gigahertz? Are you going to use 20 megahertz for 5 and 40 for 6? Or are you going to use 40 for 5 and 40 for 6? Or, a mix of 80s? So be mindful of how your clients make decisions to roam based on channel bandwidth as well as the security type. And this one's sort of a good snapshot to just keep in your back pocket. I've seen this fail a lot of times, especially when customers are trying out WPA3 transition and clients just do not like to roam between AKM types. And this is also why it's mandatory for MLO to introduce the same mandatory support for the same AKM across all 3 bands. So yeah, keep this in mind when you're doing that. But this afternoon, I think Tommy and I will just go through a couple of SSID strategies that we recommend in the dashboard. We'll show that through not only from the 6 gigahertz RF perspective, but also security. It's best to show that in the dashboard too. Now, with all that Wi-Fi 7 goodness in mind, yes, we launched an AP47 series access points a couple of months ago. It's our best in breed access point. There will be other models coming out in the future supporting Wi-Fi 7, but we decided to jam pack everything that we could. Technology-wise, like we typically do with MIST APs, has the scanning radio dedicated to all 3 bands, so that's full-time scanning for all of the good assurance features that we have. But it's tri-band. You can run different modes of operation. It's very cool that it can support dual 5 and 6, like the AP45 can on Wi-Fi 6E. It's very cool that it can support dual 6 with 5 gigahertz, but that might not necessarily be relevant in Europe, and I'll hit on that in a few moments. We've got our directional Bluetooth antenna array. That was the component that Elliot was talking about earlier this morning about the unsupervised learning for location experiences, leverages that virtual Bluetooth array. We've got a second IoT radio in there for future use cases, so that's software programmable. So, any 802.15.4 use case could be possible with that radio. We've introduced ultra wideband for even higher accuracy location, which we expect to be as well as Bluetooth, not an instead of Bluetooth use case. I'm not going to go deep on that today, just in the interest of time, but that could be quite cool. And GPS support, because obviously if these are going to be used in an environment where we want to do things like auto placement and auto location and auto orientation of the APs, it's good to know where they're located, and most Wi-Fi 7 APs will end up having some sort of GPS chipset in them, regardless of whether they're being used indoors or outdoors. Now, we have introduced dual 10 gigabit per second mgig support, so this doesn't ignore what I was saying before. Is mgig really needed for this? It's just, it's sort of part and parcel with how these access point generations go. The Wi-Fi chipsets that come with them, the Ethernet chipsets that also support them, happen to be, multi-gigabit and 10 gigabit support. So, to be honest, you could probably get away with 2.5 gigabit and you'll be fine on those interfaces, but 10 gig is the norm these days, and there's a lot of switches out there that are being shipped with 10 gig too, so it's definitely future-proofed. The really cool thing about this, and this is a first for us, we've actually built in full functionality on PoE across a single port or both ports, and it also allows PoE redundancy as well as Ethernet redundancy. So you can have failover there from a PoE and or Ethernet perspective, which is really cool. So definitely as you're moving to more, Wi-Fi as a critical service, you're going to have greater availability there on your Wi-Fi service. And obviously that factors into designing for your switch layer 2 to make sure you've got enough switch capacity to handle that. What's also new for us as well, not only do we have the integrated omnidirectional antenna access point, which is very similar to the AP45 in terms of radiation patterns, and we have the external antenna model, just like we did with the AP45E, we now have a new integrated directional antenna, the AP47D model. So that I'll go into a bit more detail about that, but that's designed for even more directionality and control of the Wi-Fi from the access point, especially in high density environments. Even with the AP47D, the thickness of the actual access point itself is only another 6 millimeters thick, so it's still quite a nice form factor to put on the ceiling. It's not going to weigh a ton like some access points of old do when they suddenly put more features in there. So it's still a nice looking AP and not overly heavy either. But I just want to take a step back. That's the most capable access point we've ever produced. It's pretty much got all of the features that a lot of customers and even Juniper Mist SEs have requested for a long time in a single access point, but it's not all about the hardware. And that was what Elliot's talk about was this morning. It's about the platform. It's about the architecture in the cloud and what a lot of you would have experienced already with Juniper Mist. Even we've got customers still running, Wi-Fi 5 AP41s out there, and they're still having a great experience, and they haven't seen a need to refresh to Wi-Fi 6 or Wi-Fi 6E because their Wi-Fi is working well because they've got the best user experience thanks to the cloud architecture. So, it's got the AI-driven radio resource management. Marvis Mini's now unlocking more capabilities, as Elliot mentioned, for that, proactive issue detection and self-testing of the network, which is also, still supported on our old access points too. So even our AP41s can run Marvis Minis, and then those integrated experience learning models as well. BLE, unsupervised machine learning, all the great assurance features that we've had from day one, thanks to that scanning radio, which has never changed in the Mist access points, getting, all of that telemetry from over 150 client states. So, the hardware does matter, but it's more than just a hardware conversation that we want you to be having when thinking about this. And so why did we do an AP47D? Just ignore these heat maps. They're from Harmona pre-release candidate. We basically saw that there was a large demand for high-density office Wi-Fi, even theaters and auditorium deployments, even stadium deployments where there wasn't necessarily the justification for the cost investment in an external antenna deployment where you've got expensive external antennas as well as your external antenna APs, but we wanted to get more directionality and control of the RF in high-density areas. So think about a large carpeted office space. Think about where you might have an open atrium and you're trying to control RF bleed and not go into the atrium across floors, and it will give you that within the single AP footprint, so you're not having to deploy external antennas. But we certainly expect that for a lot of those really complex deployments, such as high rack warehouses, stadium deployments, outdoor deployments, things like that, you'll probably still need external antennas for that proper antenna RF propagation pattern, whereas the AP47D is designed just as a highly directional patch antenna, essentially with inside an access point. Sorry, I've just got a prompt popping up here on my screen. Don't allow. There we go. So that's cool. And like I said, we've got the external antenna support as well. We were one of the first vendors to basically introduce 6 gigahertz external antenna support on our APs. So very similar to the AP45E, but now we have 3 connectors. Because we can support dual 5 and 6 or dual 6 and 5, we can do that concurrently. We now need more external antenna connectors. So the AP45E could only do single 5 and 6. Now we can do dual 5 and 6 or dual 6 and 5 with the external antennas. So that, again, adds more future-proofing and additional capabilities for that. So I mentioned briefly why this might not be so useful in Europe in the short term. The bottom section with dual 6 gigahertz, where we split the unibands across 6 gigahertz high, 5 gigahertz, and 6 gigahertz low. We don't have access to that 6 gigahertz high yet in Europe. So when that does become available, hopefully we can then make use of that with the AP47, 47D, and 47E. But at least we can do the split like we do with the AP43, AP45, with 5 gigahertz on the low bands, 5 gigahertz on the high band, and we can do 6 gigahertz. And just a little snapshot of the Ethernet failover. As I mentioned before, we've got that PoE and Ethernet redundancy. If you might have seen our Mobility Field Day presentation or one of the other webinars since, we've introduced a new AP redundancy score on the dashboard too. We've always shown the switch redundancy from a visual perspective where we can see if your APs are patched across alternate switches. But now we also link that into RF redundancy too, to make sure that you have RF redundancy should one of those switch ports or APs go down. And this is going to be very important when you're deploying AP47s to plan and cater for that redundancy as well in your design. And so with that, there's a lot more I could go deeper into, but in the interest of time, I just want to wrap it up. Is Wi-Fi 7, the nirvana we've all been looking for? No, because there will always be future Wi-Fi generations. The biggest thing that we've seen, and the thing that we're still confident about saying right now, is 6 gigahertz is the biggest impact to Wi-Fi that we've seen in the last decade or so, especially with the mandatory requirement of WPA3 bringing up a whole nother level of Wi-Fi security. So if you've got an evaluation happening at the moment, or you're considering whether to wait for Wi-Fi 7 to be more mature, I wouldn't wait. I would just adopt what you can today with 6 gigahertz and Wi-Fi 6E. You'll see a lot of benefits and improvements, not only from Wi-Fi client chipsets, but also AP vendor chipsets becoming more mature in their capabilities, and the efficiencies that they have in terms of airtime utilization too. If you're wanting to wait for Wi-Fi 7, don't be too oversold on things like multi-link operation. As I mentioned, it's very client specific. Not all clients are going to be equal when it comes to MLO, and not all MLO expectations are going to meet reality in the real world. And most importantly, you will need more power. If you haven't already refreshed to Wi-Fi 6 or Wi-Fi 6E, that will probably be the biggest need for driving switching refreshes in your deployments as well, is moving to that mandatory BT power support. So there's a couple of resources here on our website, also on the website that Peter McKenzie did for us, the design.mist.com. There's 6 gigahertz design examples in there as well, and keeping that in mind with the Harmony design examples, you've got plenty of experts here in the room today to have conversations and questions with, and with that, that's 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi in a nutshell. Thank you.